In 1944, as the Allies fought to liberate Italy, the women of Chioggiaria faced a nightmare never recorded in official histories. After the brutal battles for Monte Cassino and the desperate push toward Rome, thousands of Italian women became the targets of mass violence and terror. Atrocities so widespread, they became known as the Marocchinate. This was the hidden price of victory, exacted not by retreating Nazis, but by supposed liberators, and who, if anyone, would ever answer for what happened next. Across the battlefields of Europe, the laws of war were never meant to be optional. Even as armies clashed and empires fell, certain rules stood above the chaos, rules written into the Hague and Geneva Conventions, and recognized by every major power of the 20th century. These laws, refined after the horrors of earlier conflicts, demanded that all occupying forces protect civilians from violence. No matter the uniform, no matter the flag, the duty to shield women, children, and the vulnerable was absolute. The principle was clear: liberation could never be license for new suffering. But war always tests the limits of principle. In 1944, as the front lines moved north through Italy, legal obligations collided with the brutal realities of combat. The collapse of German control in the south did not mean safety for those left behind. Instead, the responsibility for civilian protection shifted instantly to the advancing Allies. Every fresh victory brought a new burden: the immediate safety of those who had already endured years of occupation, deprivation, and fear. For the women of Chioggiaria, the promise of rescue came laced with uncertainty. Would the new authorities enforce the rules, or would impunity simply change hands? The conventions that governed war were not technicalities. They forbade rape, pillage, and acts of reprisal against the defenseless. These bans were not suspended by battlefield necessity or blurred by the fog of war. They were meant to hold, even when the enemy was defeated and the victors stood in command. In theory, liberation meant not just the end of one tyranny, but the beginning of lawful order, a chance for justice to replace terror. Yet history is filled with moments when the letter of the law gave way to the will of the strong. The Allied advance into central Italy brought with it armies from many nations, each with their own codes and traditions. Commanders were tasked not only with defeating the enemy, but with holding their own men to the standard the world demanded. The eyes of the Vatican, the Red Cross, and the local population watched closely, expecting that the victors would uphold the very rights they had come to restore. In the chaos that follows collapse, the line between liberation and occupation can blur. For civilians, the arrival of foreign troops, however celebrated in official accounts, often meant a new kind of vulnerability. Women, especially, bore the weight of both hope and dread. Their fate would become a test of Allied legitimacy, a measure of whether the laws of war were more than empty promises. This is why the story of Chioggiaria matters. It is not only a tale of suffering, but a reckoning with the obligations that come with power and the silence that so often follows when those obligations are betrayed. Between January and May 1944, the heart of Italy became a fortress of stone and mud. The region south of Rome, known as Chioggiaria, was carved by deep river valleys and steep mountains, every ridge and village pressed into service by the German command. The so-called Winter Line, A network of bunkers and trenches stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic blocked the Allied armies from reaching the capital. Nowhere was this defense more formidable than at Monte Cassino, where the Benedictine Abbey stood watch over the Liri Valley, its ancient walls looming above the battlefield. 4 times, Allied commanders launched assaults against these positions, the first on January 17th, the last ending only on May 18th. Each attack brought new armies into the fray: British, American, Polish, Indian, New Zealand, and Free French divisions, all struggling to break the stalemate. The ground itself seemed to conspire against them. Rivers like the Rapido and Garigliano flooded their banks, turning fields into quagmires. The Aranci and Alban hills, thick with brush and rock, offered perfect cover for German machine guns and mortars. Every advance was paid for in blood. The abbey at Monte Cassino, a symbol of Western monasticism, became the most controversial landmark of the campaign. German troops occupied the slopes below, but rumors swirled that they had fortified the monastery itself. On February 15, 1944, Allied bombers leveled the abbey, reducing centuries of history to rubble in the hope of clearing a path for ground troops. The destruction echoed far beyond the battlefield, raising questions about the price of victory and the fate of civilians trapped in the crossfire. The towns of Esperia, Pico, Lanola, and countless smaller villages clung to the hillsides, their streets scarred by shell fire. For months, residents lived under curfew, sheltering in cellars as artillery thundered overhead. Each failed assault forced another wave of displacement as families fled from one ruined home to the next. By the spring, the population had thinned, and those who remained faced hunger, disease, and the constant threat of violence from both sides. In early May, Allied planners prepared for a final push, Operation Diadem. The plan called for an assault not just along the main valley roads, but through the wild, almost pathless Aurunci Mountains. Only troops trained for mountain warfare could hope to cross such terrain. The task fell to the French Expeditionary Corps, whose colonial soldiers were famed for their endurance and skill in difficult country. Their arrival would soon change the course of the campaign and the lives of thousands of civilians who had survived the winter's siege. The geography of Cassino dictated every move, every loss, every desperate decision. Here, the struggle for Rome became a contest not just of armies, but of landscapes and the people who inhabited them. For those caught between the lines, the promise of liberation was measured in ruined villages and the long shadow of the abbey's broken stones. In the spring of 1944, the French Expeditionary Corps arrived in Italy with a reputation forged in the mountains of North Africa. Under the command of General Alphonse Juin, more than 130,000 men, Moroccans, Algerians, Tunisians, and Senegalese among them, formed a force unlike any other in the Allied ranks. Their most distinctive fighters were the Goumiers, irregular Moroccan mountain soldiers organized into 24 tabors, each skilled in moving quickly and quietly across the harshest terrain. The Goumiers wore green woolen cloaks, rope sandals, and carried the curved jambia, a dagger as much a symbol of tradition as a weapon of war. The terrain of central Italy demanded such men. The Aurunci Mountains, rising steep from the valleys, were considered nearly impassable by regular armies. German defenses took advantage of every ridge and ravine, laying mines and digging in where tanks and trucks could not follow. For months, Allied plans to break the winter line had stalled on these natural obstacles. It was here, amid the rocks and scrub, that Juin's troops were given their chance. Juin, a seasoned strategist and a veteran of colonial campaigns, understood the value of speed and surprise. He ordered his goumiers to move at night, spread out in small groups, and attack from unexpected directions. Heavy equipment was left behind in favor of mobility. The goumiers advanced with little more than rifles, daggers, and the food they could carry. Their tactics: silent infiltration, sudden ambush, relentless pursuit, caught the German defenders off guard. In less than a week, the French corps had punched through the mountains, opening the road to the Liri Valley and setting the stage for the final assault on Monte Cassino. Allied commanders praised the audacity of the French attack. Reports from the US Fifth Army and British Eighth Army credited the goumiers with feats that seemed almost legendary: scaling cliffs by moonlight, capturing outposts that had held out for months, and moving faster than any mechanized unit could have managed. The official communiques spoke of courage and discipline. But behind these words lay another reality: the very qualities that made these troops effective in combat also set them apart from the regular army, and sometimes from the rules that governed it. The success of the French Expeditionary Corps was undeniable. Their breakthrough at the Aurunchi Mountains forced the German lines to collapse, allowing the Allies to surge north toward Rome. Yet as villages fell behind the front, the boundaries between soldier and civilian, between conqueror and protector, grew dangerously thin. The goumiers' reputation, already shadowed by stories from earlier campaigns, would soon become inextricably linked to both tactical triumph and moral peril. In the aftermath of battle, the fate of those left in the path of these mountain soldiers would become a question not of strategy, but of conscience. Between May 11th and 18th, 1944, Operation Diadem unfolded across the battered hills of Chiochiaria. The French Expeditionary Corps, having forced a path through the Aurunchi Mountains, now stood at the threshold of the Liri Valley. Their victory was swift and decisive, so swift in fact that the usual machinery of military order struggled to keep pace. Official staff logs from the period record a blur of movements: tabors pressing forward by night, villages changing hands within hours, and command posts scrambling to maintain lines of communication. In this atmosphere, discipline became a matter of interpretation, not routine. Orders from General Juin, preserved in the French war diaries, pressed for speed, mobility, and the utmost aggressiveness. The language spoke of honor, of the need for exemplary conduct, but also hinted at rewards, the fruits of victory, as one staff memo put it. Allied liaisons attached to the French units began to voice concern. British and American officers tasked with coordinating the multinational advance noted in their daily reports an erosion of control as the front surged north. Some logs reference complaints from local mayors about looting and civilian mistreatment relayed through hurried meetings at divisional headquarters. Yet, as the front lines dissolved into a patchwork of liberated and contested villages, the mechanisms for investigating these claims faltered. The staff records from the US Fifth Army and British Eighth Army for mid-May 1944 mention a spike in civilian distress signals, coded references to incidents and disciplinary challenges, but offer little evidence of rapid intervention. Rumors swirled among Allied ranks that certain units, especially the Gumiers, interpreted the chaos as a window of impunity. Survivor testimony collected decades later would recall the sense that, for a brief and terrible interval, no authority stood between the villagers and the victors. The French command's after-action summaries, reviewed in Paris months later, acknowledged isolated excesses, but insisted these were the acts of a few. Yet the sheer number of complaints, hundreds filed in Esperia alone, according to municipal archives, suggested a broader pattern. The climate on the ground was shaped not only by orders, but by what commanders chose to see or ignore. Staff correspondence from the period contains no explicit permission for violence, but neither do the logs show a concerted effort to halt it as the reports mounted. The Vatican and local clergy began to send their own urgent appeals, warning that the promise of liberation was curdling into something else entirely. In the space between victory and order, the fate of Ciociaria's women and families was left hanging. The Allied liaisons, watching the situation unfold, recorded their protests. But in the end, the chain of command offered little more than silence. The moral tension of those days would echo for generations, as the official record struggled to contain the truth that civilians understood all too well. The word that would haunt Ciociaria for generations was coined in those days: Maroccinate. In Italian, it means Moroccaned, a term that quickly became shorthand for a wave of violence unleashed across the liberated valleys and hills. What happened was not a matter of isolated incidents or the work of a few criminals. The pattern was systematic, spreading from one village to the next as the French Expeditionary Corps advanced. Night after night, reports came in of homes broken into, women dragged from their beds, men beaten or killed when they tried to intervene. The assaults did not spare the young or the old, nor the sanctity of churches or the authority of local officials. Looting and destruction often followed, leaving families with nothing but the memory of terror and the scars it left behind. In the town of Esperia, the mayor's records would later reveal a number so staggering it defied belief. Out of 2,500 inhabitants, more than 700 women were raped in the space of a few days. Some died from their injuries. Others never spoke of what happened, their silence a second wound. Esperia was not alone. In Pico, Lenola, Castro dei Volsci, and dozens of other towns, the same pattern repeated. The violence swept through Ciociaria and into southern Tuscany, wherever the French columns passed. Each new complaint, filed by a local priest or mayor, added to a growing archive of pain, one that would remain largely hidden for decades. Italian sources estimate that between 2,000 and over 7,000 women and girls were sexually assaulted during the spring and summer of 1944. Some advocacy groups argue the real number is even higher, pointing to destroyed records, social stigma, and the reluctance of survivors to come forward. French military investigations conducted in the years after the war recognized 1,488 victims eligible for compensation. But hospital logs from Frosinone and Cassino show a surge in admissions for sexual trauma, sexually transmitted infections, and emergency surgeries that cannot be explained by the official figures alone. Parish registers from the region document abrupt increases in deaths, births, and marriages, traces of a hidden catastrophe. The violence was not confined to any one group. While the Moroccan Goumiers bore the brunt of blame, evidence from police reports and survivor testimony implicates other units of the French Expeditionary Corps as well, including white colonial and European soldiers. The attacks were not random, but followed the path of the advancing army, often occurring in the first hours after a village changed hands. Allied officers, British and American alike, noted the pattern in their war diaries and liaison reports. The term Marocchinate entered the Italian language as a synonym for mass violation, a word that still carries the weight of those lost nights. Numbers alone cannot capture the scale of what happened, but they offer a glimpse into the crisis that unfolded. 700 assaults in Esperia, thousands more across the valleys and hills. Each figure stands for a life upended, a family changed forever, and a community left to reckon with the aftermath. Night in Chiocheria did not bring peace. As French columns pressed forward, the darkness became a cover for new terrors. Allied soldiers stationed nearby, British, New Zealanders, and Americans, later recalled hearing cries echoing from the villages below. In their diaries, some wrote of feeling helpless, forbidden by orders and language barriers from intervening as the screams rose and fell through the valleys. Chaplains and medics, summoned by desperate townspeople or stumbling upon the aftermath at dawn, described scenes that defied the official narrative of liberation. The clergy, who had so often stood as the last line of defense for their flocks, found themselves powerless. Parish priests, some themselves attacked, recorded in their ledgers not just funerals and baptisms, but the sudden, unrelenting surge of violence that swept through their communities. Medical evidence, preserved in hospital registers from Frosinone and Cassino, tells its own story. In June 1944, admissions for sexual trauma and sexually transmitted infections spiked well beyond any previous wartime levels. Doctors struggled to treat injuries that were often life-threatening and in some cases fatal. Women arrived in the wards with broken bones, torn flesh, and wounds that required emergency surgery, injuries consistent with brutal assault. The records also note a sharp increase in pregnancies, many of which would lead to hurried marriages, adoptions, or the silent placement of newborns in orphanages. For every entry in the hospital log, there were likely many more who never sought help, silenced by shame or fear of retribution. Survivor accounts, gathered years and sometimes decades later, fill in the gaps left by official records. One woman from Pico, her name withheld by request, described how groups of soldiers moved from house to house, demanding food, wine, and then far more. She spoke of neighbors who tried to resist and were beaten or killed, of children hiding under beds, and of the long silence that followed. Another testimony, preserved in the files of the Associazione Nazionale Vittime delle Marocchinate, recounts the efforts of a local priest who barricaded the church doors, sheltering dozens inside until the attackers broke through. The trauma did not end with the attacks. Many survivors endured years of illness, physical and psychological, while others faced rejection from their own families, accused of bringing dishonor or suspected of collaboration. The scale of the crisis was visible not only in the number of hospital beds filled, but in the way entire communities recoiled. In Esperia, the parish register for 1944 shows a sudden cluster of deaths, many attributed to suicide or unexplained causes. Across the region, birth records reveal a wave of children born to single mothers the following winter, their fathers listed as unknown. These traces, scattered through ledgers and memories, form a mosaic of suffering that statistics alone cannot convey. Allied medics and chaplains, confronted with the aftermath, sometimes attempted to raise alarms. Letters sent up the chain of command or scribbled in the margins of official reports mention the distress of the women and the need for intervention. Yet the machinery of war rolled on, and for most, the only option was to bear witness. The trauma of those nights would linger, etched into the bodies and minds of survivors, shaping the story of Chiochiaria long after the armies had moved on. Justice, when it arrived for the crimes committed in Chiochiaria, came haltingly and on uncertain terms. French military courts convened to address the wave of violence that followed the advance through central Italy. According to records held in the Service Historique de la Défense, 207 soldiers from the French Expeditionary Corps faced trial for acts of sexual violence and related atrocities. Of those brought before the courts, 39 were acquitted for lack of evidence. 28 men caught in the act or convicted on overwhelming proof were executed by firing squad. Others received sentences of hard labor, though the full accounting is muddied by missing files and overlapping reports. These numbers, though stark, stand in sharp contrast to the scale of the suffering. In Esperia alone, hundreds of women reported assaults, and across the valleys, the tally of victims reached into the thousands. The gap between the number of crimes and the number of prosecutions is impossible to ignore. Pressure to act did not come from the French command alone. In June 1944, the Vatican dispatched urgent telegrams to Allied headquarters and the French authorities, denouncing the atrocities and demanding protection for Italy's civilians. Papal envoys, drawing on testimony from parish priests and local bishops, pressed for swift justice and restoration of order. Their appeals, preserved in the Vatican's diplomatic archives, speak to the desperation and outrage that swept through the Church as news of the violence spread. Yet for many survivors, these interventions brought little comfort. The machinery of justice moved slowly, and the silence that followed official verdicts left most victims without recognition or restitution. In the end, the trials served less as a reckoning than as a measure of the limits of institutional response, an official record that could never match the reality lived by those left behind. Red Cross field teams arrived in Chiochiaria just days after the front moved north, their ambulances weaving through shattered roads and burned-out villages. The records they kept, now stored in provincial archives, rarely mention the word rape. Instead, the logs speak of trauma cases, gynecological emergencies, and psychological distress among women and children. In June 1954 alone, the hospital in Frosinone reported more than 200 new admissions for injuries and infections linked to assault. A surge that local doctors quietly attributed to the violence of the preceding weeks. Confidential notes from Red Cross nurses describe women refusing to speak, refusing even to give their names, and sometimes fleeing the walls before treatment was finished. Political leaders in Rome and the provincial capitals faced a dilemma. The Allied victory was still fresh, the need for unity urgent, and the presence of foreign troops a delicate fact. Local councils in towns like Esperia and Pico filed formal complaints, but these were often rooted into bureaucratic dead ends. Minutes from council meetings in May and June record appeals for justice, but also wrongs to avoid provoking the authorities or damaging relations with the liberators. In public, officials spoke of reconstruction and gratitude. In private, they compiled lists of the injured and dead, sealing them in envelopes marked confidential. The press, too, largely fell silent. Italian newspapers, under pressure from both military censors and their own editors, buried references to the attacks in vague reports about this or unrest. Foreign correspondents who visited the region found doors closed and stories whispered. If told at all, the humanitarian logs and municipal records became, in effect, the only witnesses willing to remember. Over time, the silence hardened. The crimes faded from public view, not because they were forgotten, but because the cost of speaking was judged too high. For the women of Giochiaria, survival meant more than enduring a single night of violence. The aftermath stretched across lifetimes, shaping families and silencing entire communities. Many survivors found themselves isolated, carrying walls that could not be seen, and stories they were told never to repeat. Months that followed the attacks, local authorities and parish priests quietly arranged for the care of children born from rape. Some placed in orphanages, others sent to distant relatives, their origins left unspoken. Hospital records from Frosinone and Cassino tracked a wave of emergency admissions for trauma and infection, but the greater suffering unfolded in private. Women dismissed from their jobs, turned away by neighbors, or even forced from their homes. Years passed before most survivors spoke openly. Shame and fear kept many silent, even as the memories refused to fade. It was not until decades later, with the founding of the Associazione Nazionale Viti delle Barochinat, that survivors began to share their accounts in public. Oral histories collected by the association reveal a common thread: resilience in the face of abandonment and a determination to be heard after so many years of being ignored. The group became a voice for those who had been denied justice, pushing for recognition, support, and the right to remember. Through their activism, the long shadow of the Moroccan Act began to lift, if only slightly. Their testimonies, preserved in archives and memorials, stand as a record of both the suffering endured and the strength required to survive it. In June 2004, a small ceremony unfolded in Esperia, attended by survivors, local officials, and representatives from Morocco's Veterans Association. General Abdelaziz Ben Ali, speaking on behalf of the Moroccan ex-combatants, offered a formal apology for the violence committed by Koumié 60 years earlier. He condemned the crimes as a betrayal of the army's values, expressing sorrow and solidarity with the victims. This gesture, though welcomed by many in Giochiaria, carried no official weight beyond the association itself. The French government, whose troops had marched through these valleys, has never issued a formal apology. Efforts to secure one have met silence, both from state authorities and from the leading French veterans organizations. For many, this absence is not just a diplomatic detail. It is a wound that refuses to close. The question of compensation has followed the same uncertain path. Only in 2015 did the Italian parliament pass a law granting financial redress to survivors of wartime sexual violence. The statute established a lump sum, €25,000 for each recognized victim. Yet the hurdles to claim this support remain steep. Decades of silence, lost documents, and the burden of proof have meant that only a handful of survivors have received compensation. Parliamentary records show that by 220, successful claims numbered in the single digits. For most, the promise of justice has been as elusive as acknowledgement itself. The legacy of the Moroccanate remains unfinished. The apology from Moroccan veterans stands alone, a symbol of private conscience rather than public reckoning. Italian law now recognizes the suffering, but the process is slow and incomplete. And in France, official silence continues to overshadow the voices of those who still wait for recognition. The story of Chior Chiaria lingers unresolved, a reminder that the burdens of war are not easily set aside by the passage of time or the shifting of borders. Medical records from June 1944 show a marked increase in trauma and sexually transmitted infections among women in Chior Chiaria, a direct result of the mass assaults known as the Maracaineaut. The documentary has revealed that at least 2,000 to 7,000 civilians, mostly women, suffered violence after the Allied breakthrough, and that only 207 French troops were tried, with 28 executed. Vatican telegrams, Red Cross reports, and survivor testimonies confirm the scale of suffering, yet the full number of victims remains unverified. Due to stigma and incomplete documentation, no archival evidence shows explicit permissive orders from high command. And to this day, the French government has not issued a formal apology. In 2015, Italy passed a law recognizing survivors, but many still seek justice and acknowledgement. Confronting these records is essential, not only to honor those who endured the violence, but to remind us that the costs of war often remain unresolved long after the battle's end.